Good morning or good afternoon in Curaçao. I'm really happy to give this presentation about my book, Survival in Paradise, which, as you know, is a memoir of growing up in Curaçao in the 1940s, though there are many other things going on in this book other than the reminiscences of Curaçao. Nevertheless, I just want to say I wish I could be with you in Curaçao. And I think back very, very fondly of the time that I spent in Curaçao from roughly very early 1944 to 1951, 7 formative years, from the age of, let us say, 9 to 16. I came to the US at the age of almost 17, and indeed the last chapter in my book is from Curaçao to Brandeis. Now, I should say that the first chapter of Survival in Paradise, which, by the way, the book came out in 2014, I should say that the first chapter is about our escape during the middle of the war in 1942 from the Netherlands, by way of France, by way of Spain, by way of Portugal, and by way of Suriname, where we spent the year before we came to Curaçao. Now, my family, that is to say, my father, mother, and my older brother and I, we did this together, of course. The 2 children were relatively aware of what was happening, but my brother and I were small children. Nevertheless, the first chapter is in nature rather different from the rest of the book in that it's what I think of as a rather gripping escape story. And that is the chapter called 1942. It takes us all the way to Suriname. The second chapter takes place in Suriname. From the third chapter on, we are in Curaçao. So the world we left behind was a world of war, it was a world of danger, it was a world of threat. The world in which we arrived in Curaçao was a world of peace. And for the kids, that is to say my brother and me, a world of fun, though not unmitigated fun, because after all, we were living surrounded by a culture that was relatively different from ours. The school culture was, in a sense, a somewhat Dutch school culture, to be sure. But as you can well imagine, the culture of the kids was a Curaçaoan culture, a Caribbean culture, a much more exuberant culture than any that I was used to. And certainly there was a culture clash between the Dutch teachers and the Curaçaoan kids. And I try to show this, I hope amusingly, on my first day of school when Mr. da Costa Gomes, yes, the younger brother of Doctor, when Mr. da Costa Gomes had lost his stick and the kids were improvising. They were doing a kind of dance. They were doing a sort of ritualistic response to his tale of the lost stick. He kept saying, "Where is my pirlala?" He called the stick the pirlala. And all kinds of kids right around me were fantasizing about the pirlala and having seen it, or having seen it at Westbrand, or having seen it on a passing car. So my aim in showing that scene was not only to make you laugh, my aim was also to show the difference between my expectation. Finally, I was in school. finally I was in a regular school. But this regular school turned out not to be really regular. It was superbly taught. Both the Curaçaoans and the Dutch teachers were excellent. But the mood that prevailed was zany and occasionally silly, as when Mr. da Costa Gomes tries to find out what the best cigarette lighter on the market is, and he has all the kids come up and test the lighter. This probably would not go on right now in a school, but it did then. And I thought it was all a little crazy, and I suppose that as a fairly straight-laced Dutch refugee kid, I remained in that frame of mind. I continued to think it was all a bit crazy, but I got used to it, and I started to enjoy it. I, above all, craved a sense of normalcy. Did I get that sense of normalcy? Not really, not completely, not fully. Curaçao was not Holland. Holland is where I wanted to be. Curaçao was not Holland, but it was Dutch enough, if you see what I mean. There were many Dutch things, and there were Dutch ways, and there were Dutch teachers, and there was the Dutch language, alongside Papiamento, of course, which the kids spoke with each other. So it was a world of normalcy, but not quite. As for how we were looked at, we, the Dutch refugees, and there weren't that many, really. There were maybe 100 Dutch refugees who had come during the middle of the war, probably fewer than that. But as to how we were looked at, I have no resentment whatsoever about the way the Curaçaoans treated us, received us. It seems to me we were welcomed with open arms. Now, it is true that the Dutch people, especially the colonial types, you know, the ones who were running the administration of the island, by and large, some Curaçaoans were involved in the running of the island, but still, mostly it was done by the Dutch. They had that kind of formal psychology. They had that, well, I call it a psychology. It showed itself mainly in the language. They spoke a kind of formal Dutch. They were very often rather forbidding types, and certainly contrasted beautifully with a certain zaniness in the Curaçaoans, but they tended to be on the stern and slightly forbidding side. And as for their view of us, the refugees, well, they didn't really see us as all that fully Dutch. For one thing, we were Jewish. For another, we had mixed international backgrounds. Some of these colonial officials had been on the island since the 1930s and really knew little about the war, knew little about what had happened to their Holland in their absence. Of course, they read the newspapers, of course they were aware, but there was a kind of cluelessness in them about what was really going on. And indeed, in 1942, the worst of it hadn't really happened yet. You know, the news of the concentration camps in Europe and so on came somewhat later. So at the very beginning of our stay in Curaçao, there was perhaps a degree of incomprehension, but again, I can find no fault with the way we were received, with the way we were viewed. There are certainly true clashes. That's too strong a word. There are conflicts, there are frictions between the two sides, but then there were frictions between all sides. For instance, the Polish Jewish merchants, many of whom had arrived in Curaçao in the 1920s and the 1930s, they were extremely different types from all the other groups, and some of them were resented a little bit by the Curaçaoans, but not much. For one thing, they spoke Papiamento and they spoke it well. In fact, I am often amazed at the polyglot quality of Curaçao. Both the Curaçaoans and the Polacos, the Jewish merchants, and even the Dutch, but mostly the Dutch did not speak Papiamento. But there was a great deal of mastery of languages that to this day I admire, especially living here in the United States, which, as you know, is mainly monolingual, though perhaps rapidly becoming more bilingual with Spanish as a second language for a great many people. So these various groups sort of rubbed against each other, but by and large were harmonious. I can say that really the quality of their being differed. The formality of the Dutch is what I had a great deal of fun with in the book. And remember, I had to simulate all these languages in a text written in English. But the formality of this, speech on the part of the Dutch, I tried to render when I, for instance, in an early scene in the book, when I was taken to the house of my friend Peter, and I say Peter stood up straight, one hand toying nervously with his flaxen hair. Father, mother, this is my friend Manny from school. Mrs. Foscus smiled broadly and got up from a small, straight-backed chair in a little alcove off the living room. She was younger than her husband, tall and blonde. I had seen her out shopping a few times and admired her lithe, energetic walk. She addressed her husband with a show of enthusiasm. Jan, what a fine occasion. Yes, said Dr. Voskus. He was a dentist. Yes, said Dr. Voskus, an occasion for rejoicing. And I remember afterwards that he said, moeder, he called her, we zullen de bloemetjes moeten buiten zetten. Which I guess means, there were many Dutch sayings, but I guess what it means is you're going to celebrate so hard that the little flower pots will have to be taken out of the room lest you disturb them. Anyway, that's my interpretation of this rather silly Dutch saying. But that formality was very important for me to render in the book, and that's something that obtained and something that characterized the attitude of a great many of the Dutch colonial types, that there was a sort of mission civilisatrice, a sort of civilizing mission that was partly involved in the colonial enterprise. Now remember, I'm describing a time in the 40s when you could call it the era the era of late-stage colonialism, a benign colonialism, in my opinion. A colonialism where already autonomy was being talked about at great length, and what to do and how to prepare for the transition to autonomy. So autonomy and maybe some form of independence was very much on people's minds. Was it on my mind? Well, yes and no. What was mainly on my mind was my adolescence, being a little more like the other Curaçaoan kids and maybe the Dutch kids, fitting in a little more in this new and vibrant culture that I had come to, And I think maybe above all, my adolescence and all my engagements and embroilments in the adolescent life served the function of a kind of a blotting out of the past, and a blotting out of the war, and a blotting out of all the sad subjects my family and my parents kept bringing up. And that continued to cast a shadow over everything. I show, for instance, that even when 1948 comes around and the formation of the State of Israel, that in my parents' contacts with one of the young women, one of the Haganah women who came around to the island to raise money for Israel, that even in that interchange, almost immediately, it turns out she has a European background and her family was wiped out during the war. So it's something I show throughout the book, that again and again, the war casts its shadow over my parents and to some extent over me, and that the real antidote for me was to work against, or to not so much work against, but to blot out the past with the joys of the present and the pleasures of adolescence, and of course the pain and the anguish of adolescence too. So Curaçao for me almost fulfilled the role of a kind of drug. I suppose you could say the drug of the power of now, the drug of the present. The drug of having fun and thinking of the future as a way of not thinking about the past. And I often think, especially now that I'm old, I'm 81, I often think that life has to be lived in a kind of denial. This is against so much of what psychology tells us. But when my friends and I start talking about death and dying, my instinct sometimes is to say, I wonder what's playing in the movies. It's a way of saying that we really can't do anything about these horrors, about approaching death. Let us cultivate our garden, as Voltaire famously said. Let us really absorb ourselves in the present. And that's what I think I show throughout the book, that I am constantly waging a kind of battle to live in the present, but the shadow of the war comes back again and again to insist really on a kind of return to pain and return to sorrow. And to be sure, my parents never escaped that. My mother died very young, and that too is described in the book. But my father certainly became ever more obsessed with what he had lost and what happened in Europe. And in that, he mirrors, I think, the fate of all Holocaust survivors. My own role is maybe a little different from that, in that my view is that though I can never let go of it and can never really forget it, I am still occasionally and partly successful in suppressing those painful memories, in living sometimes with them, sometimes not, but at any rate in undoing them to some extent. But that is a decision that has to be made and remade, and even at the very end of the book, when I'm at Brandeis University, a more or less Jewish university in the United States, more or less, because it was not deeply religious, but a Jewish-sponsored university, even there, I have to fight against the incomprehension of others, and at the same time, my own inclination to fall back on the past. Even there, I have to force myself to live in the present and to live in the future. There are many other things I wanted to tell you about this book, but probably that's enough for one session. When you read the book, first of all, I hope you'll occasionally laugh hard. Secondly, I hope you'll see that I very often render different languages in different tones of English, different registers. This is an achievement I feel very proud of, though the critics have not necessarily noticed that, but I think you as Curaçaoans do and will notice it, because you know when someone speaks Papiamento, it's kind of evident, even though in the book he's speaking English. When someone speaks formal Dutch, you will hear it. Nou, moeder, nu moeten we toch iets doen. You know, that kind of tone is rendered there. Also, Yiddish, of course, the Yiddish of the refugees, though not all of them spoke Yiddish, some of them spoke Dutch mainly, but certainly the Yiddish of the Polacos, and occasionally other languages are suggested and insinuated. At any rate, having talked to you about all of this, I want to once again say to you, I wish I were with you, and I want to wish you Turcos bom, Mashadanki.